Hey, everybody. We're having a conversation today on the Sales Management Association's latest research on go to market planning. And our conversation is going to shift now to focus on the growing and the evolution of sales technology and the change that there and how the speed sometimes is even surpassing our comfort and our skill in this area. So, James, there was one piece of this research that really stood out to me. It said 48% of companies experienced a high degree of change in sales technologies and tools in the past 3 years. And then 68% project there'll be a high degree of change over the next few years as well. So we've talked about change a whole bunch. I think we all realize change is happening. It's hard. It's happening faster. But where have you seen the impact of that change the most in your role in go-to-market over the last 15, 20 years?
I think the biggest change that I've seen is that there's a huge focus, and there still is a huge focus on it, but it's maybe not as big on the execution of the seller. So things like CRM, conversational intelligence tools, enablement tools, forecasting tools, all of those are still getting the focus that they rightfully deserve. But what I've seen emerge recently is the investments and the focus on strategic tools. So how do you set up that execution for ultimate success by leveraging the strategic investments in technology and then supporting their team through to execution? And the great part about this that I found is that execution tools typically are pretty hard to adopt. A seller is generally fairly change adverse. So trying to get them to adopt that is a little bit more difficult. But when you think about it, the power of investments in strategic technology is the ability to help you amplify across the overall strategic direction across the entirety of the team who are executing. Take, for example, I was working with an organization over here that came to us and they're talking about, I have a problem with how do I utilize my compensation plan to effectively communicate our strategy. And with a conversation centered mostly around the fact that it basically had become a fairly boring legal document. And what they wanted to do was make it much more engaging, make it be an interactive or tool that they can utilize to communicate what that strategy was. And they looked at it as a way for them to storyboard how they want their sellers, those who are executing, to understand what the strategic direction is of the organization. So they took this storyboard approach and they realized that that compensation plan document is a story that they're telling to their sellers, those who are executing, about how they want them to behave, what actions they want them to take. And that really ultimately led to a great adoption of that plan, but also a lot of engagement with that plan, because it was no longer just a legal document I had to sign. It was actually, oh, this has a lot of really good information about what I am as an individual and supposed to do and how am I supposed to act, how I'm supposed to go ahead, and ultimately how the heck I'm going to make money.
That's right. And in addition to just knowing how I'm going to get paid, which still is a big piece of it, it's moving away from a punitive exercise and putting boundaries and boxes around me to actually helping me understand what is the strategy of my organization? What is it they're trying to really accomplish? And how am I individually a part of this thing that's a little bit bigger than myself too, as well. So I see that. And if we look at strategic tools like you're talking about, I love that you talked about this. There's the execution side of this, which I do want to get to in a minute. And then there's the planning side of it. How did the organization use technology to help us set our teams up better for success? How do we use data? How do we use insight to help with our territory decisions? How do we help that with how we allocate and assign quota, all these kinds of things, so that the execution is stronger? So I love that setup and that kind of dynamic between those two things. But one thing I feel like I hear this all the time, I imagine you hear this all the time, is we almost just say this blanket term of AI and assume that this is going to solve it and that everything that we are doing is AI led. And we assume that that's what our customers want to hear. It's what our sellers want to hear. But the reality is, in conversation, does anybody really know what that means? I think we're getting more towards a place of understanding and utility of AI. But in your use cases and how you're talking with companies, what have you seen? What have you heard about AI? Where is it being used? How's it being used well? Where's it not being used well?
Yeah, and you highlight it quite well. And actually, Mark Altshuler, our CEO, has led a roundtable at one of our events in the UK, which was AI, a wasteland of interesting use cases too compelling to ignore. And it really is exactly like you said. You know, we use that blanket term AI. what does it mean to individuals? Is it generative AI? Is it predictive AI? Is it all those other ones that I can't remember because there are so many other different things that incorporate that entire bucket of what AI is? And listen, it's out there and it's becoming more and more prevalent in every one of the conversations that we're having. And everybody that we're talking to is saying, I need to use AI. I want to do this. I want to do this right. And it's going to revolutionize, tough word apparently, for in terms of the way that we decide and implement, say, things like incentive programs. There's so much data out there to analyze, identify patterns, make predictions that'll give sales leaders a better idea of how they can design these plans to motivate the behaviors that they want. But I think the interesting thing, and during Mark's talk that I was mentioning there, he did a really good job of saying, listen, when you look at AI, there are some things that you can do that aren't overly intensive in terms of an effort that you can get a real amount of value from. But then there are some things that are going to take a heck of a lot of effort, but you're only going to derive a medium or maybe even a high amount of value from it. And you have to start to weigh that as you're going through. Areas where I've seen it done really well, which is sort of good sort of low-hanging type fruit that has a huge impact, are things like account scoring and segmentation, territory optimization. Whereas if you start to look at AI to really understand and even predict what an incentive plan should look like, that is a heck of a lot of effort. There's a lot of different impacts that could be there. So trying to do all of that is it's possible. It's just how much effort versus how much result can you get out. And the last thing I wanted to add on this, and it came from a conversation I had with our partner over here, Accenture, which was they had this idea that AI is not intelligent from the first moment you use it. It gets more and more intelligent the more and more you work with it. So there's no better time to start now, because it's only going to get more and more smart and further and further away in terms of where you're going. So that's really something that I impart with the individuals listening to this, is that we have to start in a smart and productive and efficient way.
Yeah, one of the areas where I feel like the greatest opportunity coming, and maybe it's really interesting to me, it seems to be interesting when I talk with other people about it, is when you've described AI for kind of these really effective use cases, account scoring and segmentation, territory optimization, these kinds of things, obviously really important for the organization to kind of have a one-to-many approach for how we use AI. But really, I feel like the next evolution of this is, how do those kinds of tools affect and impact and really help maximize the individual efforts of a salesperson? And what you described earlier, if I'm a salesperson, I probably want to minimize noise in my world. I don't know how eager I would be to try to use a bunch of new tools or whatever it might be. But if we even look at the tiny use case of generative AI and how some salespeople have used that to speed up their research that they're doing on companies, and to maybe even personalize or reframe or rethink their engagement strategies, I think we're starting to maybe see this turn a little bit of, okay, maybe there are some tools like that at the individual level that I can start to use. And I'll tell you that one of the most important conversations and application points with this that we've been talking about internally is to say, how do we actually put that power in the hands of a salesperson? Whereas from a macro perspective, maybe we've looked at account scoring and segmentation or the optimization of the territory at the macro level. How can a salesperson use that kind of information very specifically on the accounts that they're responsible for to expose untapped opportunities in the accounts that they are engaging with? How are they actually activating and pursuing the highest value pursuits in areas where maybe they didn't have data and insights before, right?
Yeah. And I think if you go back to one of the previous conversations we had around compensation plan documents and the communication thereof, if you can enhance that you talk about the strategic view down to the execution view, empowering them with the strategic decisions that were made in terms of how that territory or how that quota was carved up, to give them that information. Hey, listen, you've got 10 accounts. These are the 10 accounts. You're expected to get $1 million here, $500K there, and going through that and giving them that information and building that trust almost to say, listen, we didn't just pick a number out of the air, but we did the strategic approach. We did a lot of analysis, scoring, segmentation, but empowering them with that information gives them a lot of more power to be able to go and spend their time more efficiently and more wise.
Yeah, that's right. I think about even some of the holistic, we talked about data in one of our first conversations too. And so if I've got 10 accounts that I'm going after, what if we can look at the aggregate data from our sales force and say, what's our projected time to close? Can we use AI to actually help us derive time to close metrics or win rate metrics or the potential of deals, the propensity to buy? We layer in third-party data into that conversation. And then as I'm looking at my little workbench of the 10 deals that I could pursue, I'm actually able to be more intentional about, well, this is an industry that we have a stronger foothold in, or this is a customer that there's more buying signals from our external third-party data that's supporting that maybe they are more ripe to buy at this point in time. And then maybe I can model even out some of my projected earnings with that to say, well, if I sell them this, or if I position this instead, how is that going to impact my compensation? So what you're doing is you're actually putting in the crosshairs for the salesperson their CRM data, their external third-party data, the research they may have done on the customer, their territory data, their quota data, their compensation data. If you could put all of that in the crosshairs to help them make more daily decisions about where they invest their time and effort, I think that's where the next wave of conversation in sales technology is probably going.
And the only way that you can do that is through a connected approach, right? Like being able to bring all of those different things together is effectively connecting that data. But if you've done that, the territory in one spot, the quota in one spot, target in one spot, you do the compensation plan in another, it doesn't have that connectivity to be able to empower the seller to go ahead and be as efficient as possible. So I think, absolutely what you're talking about there. The other thing that I picked up as you were speaking there was all of the things that you're talking about are all the strategic decisions that were made using those strategic technologies that we talked about earlier, driving that down to the execution. So they are trying to make sure that you've got to be able to do those things up front to drive the overall go-to-market strategy, go-to-market planning, to reference the report specifically. If you do that well, you're able to do that, such a better job filtering that down to the individuals who are ultimately going to go out and be that face of your organization to the customer. And that really, I think, is where we're going to start to see a huge improvement in the way that we can empower our sellers to just be that little bit better.
James, the last thing I'll say here is that maybe this is a little bit risky as a software executive, but more software isn't always the answer, right? More is not always more in this area. And so I think everything that we're talking about here, to get the most out of the promise of AI, to get the most out of the promise of any software that an organization invests in, means you have to dig a little bit deeper. You've got to identify the real problem that you're trying to solve. You've got to identify, importantly, the practices or the processes that need to be adjusted and fixed in the context of that problem. Otherwise, you're just layering software on top of bad, and you're going to continue to get more bad and amplify the bad, right? So you've got to consider...
Let's not amplify the bad, yeah.
Yeah, let's not use software to amplify bad. Let's get it to correct and help us get to more good. And so many times software can certainly be a good course of action, but it's only when you're taking the right steps for it to get the most out of those tools. And I hope we'll see more of that in the future. Hope we'll continue this conversation, and there's a lot more to come because change is coming fast, and there's a lot of good things in the future as well.